Okay, so just a reminder for those who weren't with us last time, and I didn't get it on the beginning of the recording. Our study here is going to be what we're calling characters of God, or how to read the Bible and perhaps learn something along the way. We did Adam and Eve last week. We're looking at Rebekah and Jacob today, and depending on how far we get, we might get to Paul and Jesus. Part of what the reason Paul and Jesus in particular are last is because as Christians, we read a lot of the New Testament.
No, don't worry about it. You can hear him.
Lois, you might want to mute your phone. You can leave us on, but maybe mute it because we're hearing you. But the premise behind this study is that as Christians, when we focus on the New Testament, we see Jesus as the perfect example, and then we have Paul giving the new law, and so sometimes we don't read as carefully the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, where it tells us lots of things that may or may not be
overhead lighting
expected to be taken directly. So, and I think this week's study is really going to exemplify that. So. And for those who are curious, I mentioned last week, the British Museum has their, oopsie, I did that last time. They've got lots of their manuscripts available, the medieval manuscripts images. So I've taken these from various manuscripts, and I confess to having gotten impatient with copying them all down. But this is the birth of Jacob and Esau. And I don't know whether you all had a chance to read through, but just a reminder, right? We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the patriarchs, Abraham and Sarah. Sarah giving birth to Isaac, but not until after Abraham kind of got tired of waiting for an heir and took Hagar, his concubine, as a to bear a child who was Ishmael. So there was this conflict between Isaac and Ishmael. And then Isaac took his wives, and Rebekah was giving birth, was pregnant with 2 children. She was barren. This theme of barrenness is another really interesting theme to follow through. And there's a kind of interesting contrast. We're just a couple of weeks behind the visitation of Elizabeth, or Mary, to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was barren, and Mary was pregnant unexpectedly. And so here we find Genesis 25, we get Jacob. Now, I'm curious what your general impressions of the biblical character of Jacob are as we get going. Anybody want to share some thoughts?
Well, Jacob was basically a liar and a cheater.
Okay, Mac. Good. Well, yes, that's what we're gonna look at all of that. Other folks, did anybody have a more positive view of Jacob?
Yeah, I will offer. You asked us to read this kind of like a novel.
Yeah.
So I did a couple of different versions, and actually, you could see that he was just doing what his mother told him to do. So the whole thing reads like a soap opera. So I think you have to me, I have to focus on what the point of this is at some point,
Yeah, and it's interesting, to Mac's comment. Frederick Buechner, I think you all know, is one of my favorite authors, and I get a daily email from Buechner, really from the foundation, and he's not, he's older. I think he's 96 or something now, so I seriously doubt if he's producing the email lists. But one of the emails this past week was, in fact, his description of Jacob, and he describes and talks about Jacob as kind of a liar and a cheat, and it is funny because that's exactly what the text has for us. And I think a lot of people, a lot of Jews and Christians, without reading closely the text, We know that he's the one he wrestles with God. He becomes Israel. He's the father of the 12 tribes, ultimately, of Israel, and has this, he's the eponymous ancestor of all of Israel. And yet, yeah, this story is very soap opera-like, and he is a liar and a cheater. And when I read Buechner just describing it, basically summarizing the biblical book, I have to say, as a guy named Christian who's been in Jewish studies my whole academic career, I read it and I thought, oh, you can't say that. That sounds very anti-Semitic. But that's just the text. That's what's there. And it is interesting when we're not reading the text, but we just sort of filter it through our broader reception history is what we'd call it. Jacob gets tidier along the way, right? But the fact that the biblical text leaves it in this way, I think is what's worth negotiating and looking at. So I thought this was, by the way, a very interesting illumination here of the children being born. Genesis 25. She's barren, Rebekah, and the Lord granted Isaac's prayer that his wife conceive. So she conceives, and she's got 2 children. By the way, there's so much in all of these that I'd love to do, so feel free to just kind of circle your finger and tell me to move on if I get bogged down here. So she's pregnant. She's got twins. Well, she doesn't know yet. I mean, she might have a clue, but it's just so painful. She says, if it is to be this way, why do I live? That is such a real moment to me in the Bible, that we in our relatively modern and antiseptic take into account. In fact, it will be Rachel, Jacob's wife, will die in childbirth, giving birth to the son she calls Ben-Omi, but he calls Benjamin. It was a very distinct and real possibility that women would die in childbirth. And that the woman and the child would die. And she just is like, Lord, if it's to be this way, why bother? Take me now. Take me now, Lord. And God says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. Afterwards, his brother came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Yaakov. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, living in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So what do you take from that? What's your first thought on reading that passage? I like Marcy's comment, if it's to be this way, why do I live? The thoughts of many parents whose kids do not get along.
Well, back to what you said about Jacob gets tidier. One thing that struck me is with sons, and they're very different. They both have wonderful qualities, and they also have things that they've needed to work through. And my husband would say, yeah, one of them's just like him, adventurous, and one of them's more of a rule follower, like me. So obviously we do accuse each other of, at times, going towards one or the other because it's more like us.
Mm-hmm. Or there is a preference.
Right.
That you start to lean towards, well, this one. I have to say, by the way, I have an older brother, and yeah, this was very interesting to be reworking this material last night in current context of my own family. Other thoughts? What does, for example, what does the Lord's prophecy actually tell Rebekah? I don't mean repeat it back to me, but what's the sense of it? It says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. Right? So we know what the text says. That's easy enough. The younger, who will be Jacob, it turns out, of course, will rule over the elder, Esau, Edom. But what is that prophecy saying? What's the impact of that message for Rebekah, do you think?
Maybe she just aligned herself with the one who is going to be the powerful one.
Okay, so yeah, so Kathy, so there's a sense of well, now she knows who's going to be on top. I might as well hitch my horse to that wagon. No, my wagon to that horse, I guess it would be, right?
Give her considerable abilities.
Yeah, and I think you're alluding to a reality here, which is these family constructs were very complicated and very political. Multiple wives and concubines, the negotiation of it, and as elders would die or move on, jockeying for position, right? So making sure she's on the winning side. So she hears this. What does it not tell her? Doesn't tell her that. Go ahead.
It doesn't tell her which one.
Doesn't tell her which one yet. It tells her it'll be the younger. So she's got to trust her midwife to help her sort that out. It doesn't tell her that she's going to live. And in fact, when Rachel dies, her midwife reassures Rachel, it's going to be okay. You've given birth to an interesting comment we could have about value of women and mothers relating to that particular passage. So initially, in terms of gestation, of pregnancy, it was probably somewhat encouraging, but it leaves a big question mark, right? She's saying, why do I live? You live to give birth to nations, is what it seems to be saying, which may or may not be terribly encouraging to someone. And now what about the boys? So we've got, throughout this story, we have a lot of etiology. Etiology are stories that tell us the origins of names of things. So Esau will also be known as Edom. Edom means red. I'm guessing Jacob probably came out red as well, having seen our children be born. Esau is hairy. The hairy and Esau etymologically don't match up quite as neatly as Edom and red, because that is the word for red. But Jacob, Yaakov, now if you can, I don't know if you can see on that picture, but in the drawing, the one that's still pictured as coming out of Rebekah is holding on to his heel. And Yaakov is from that verb. Akav, it means heel in Hebrew. And when you convert that noun into a verb, it means to overtake or to usurp. So like if you're running behind somebody and you catch up on their heels and you overtake them. And so you've got here this image of the younger overtaking, usurping the elder. So we do have this whole setup now. I mean, this is one of the things about so much of the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew literature. A quick digression. We often as Christians trying to be sensitive will refer to it as the Hebrew Bible, and I do that academically. The reality is nobody calls it the Hebrew Bible but academics. Jews call it Torah or Tanakh. We call it the Old Testament. It's absolutely fine in our Christian context to call it the Old Testament. So every now and then, to specify the nature of the literature and so forth, you'll hear me say Hebrew Bible, but I just needed to get that pet peeve out. But it is, there is this value to it as literature, right? We've got foreshadowing here. We've got a setup, and it's not just we can sometimes lose sight of the literary nature by looking at the obvious. Here's a prophecy. Here's what's going to happen. But look at the style, look at the bigger aspects, and as Anne was pointing out, parents playing favorites. Now, I don't know how well you remember your earlier Genesis, but I alluded to it before. right? There is already a not great history of sibling rivalry in Genesis, isn't there?
Mhm.
We've got this history of Isaac and Ishmael, and it does not work well. We've got this history of the jealousy between the two mothers. Here we have one mother, but now we've got mother and father pitted against each other. There is a whole discussion, there's a whole study we could do of Genesis about I was going to say the do's and don'ts, but the don'ts of parenting. You know, I mean, we talk about the real tragedy that that people who are physically abused as children often become abusers themselves. Well, I think Genesis just really clearly shows us the way that works emotionally too, and we'll get to that unfortunately here. But so we do need to think about those preferences. We do need to think about that favoritism and so forth. And I think that's one of the really strong underlying messages here. That again, it's the nature of this kind of literature as opposed to Paul, where it doesn't say, hey, don't show preference for one child over against another. Treat all equally, for all are created in the image of God, and we should love them in this way. That's the sort of thing Paul would say, right? Genesis says, let me tell you a story. And we've got to think through the impact. All right. So we then get to, as they grow up, Esau and Jacob are each beloved by a different parent. And so we get this, in Genesis 25, we get this little interlude, as it were. It moves our plot forward for sure, but it also builds our characters a little more. Once when Jacob was cooking a stew, I'm famished. Therefore he's called Edom. It's lentil stew is actually what it is. My wife loves lentils. Jacob said, first, sell me your birthright. Esau said, I am about to die. My internet is unstable. Esau says, I am about to die. Of what use is my birthright to me? Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. All right, what about this little interlude? Any thoughts when you read it? Or as I was reading it?
Well, I'm not sure I ever understood the difference between the birthright and the blessing.
So I'll come back to that. I promise.
So I guess Esau that was his nature. He just was going to be more of a lazy, just go out in the woods and hunt.
Okay, so something about the nature. I don't know that I would say lazy. He's out in the wilderness, you know, he's out there hunting. He's, you know, that's heavy manual labor, right? So
Yes.
it's not a physical laziness for sure. Harriet, I think you were going to.
Oh, I was just going to say hunger, anger, you know, be careful.
He's hangry.
Yeah, what you do when you're hungry, angry. Have you ever heard halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired? He was tired and hungry and angry and gave it all away for that.
And so, right. So Harriet, so what is it? What does this tell us about his character when he gets hangry, you know, halt?
Well, I mean, he seems to be more, volatile's not the word, but, you know, just reactive instead of,
Excellent.
Jacob is thinking and
There you go.
plotting.
Exactly. So, right. So the characters are being developed here. And again, if we're teaching writing, what a great job. We've just got a handful of verses, a handful of lines here. And it draws out Jacob. Jacob's home cooking stew. He's the homebody. Mom, what can I get for you? Mom, how did you make that? That was wonderful. What's your recipe, Mom? He's home doing that, which is not to say, I'm not suggesting it's unmanly at all, because that, you know, cooking and doing those sorts of things is something everybody needed to know. But he was home in the tents, right? I think that's what it, I got to find my previous slide. Jacob was a quiet man living in tents, right? So he stayed home with mom, whereas Esau was out in the fields. And then, as Harriet was just saying, Esau, he's an immediate guy. I'm hungry, I want food. Well, okay, Jacob thinking ahead. And here's one of the questions. Again, there's so much the Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know what Rebekah told Jacob growing up. Was he hearing from earliest age that, baby, don't you worry about Esau. He's going to serve you. You're going to take your father's place someday. You're going to be the one to inherit. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. I kind of think she probably did, as we'll see as the relationship develops. But Jacob he sees this, let's put it this way. He sees this as an opportunity, right? And so the birthright, to Anne's question, birthright is the inheritance. The blessing is the supernatural. The blessing is the divine gift that a father can bestow upon his child. And the view was that a dying father, and we'll get to it, that what is declared, the blessing that's declared, is what will happen. It is a prayer to God that will be fulfilled. And this is why you'll see when Jacob, at the end of Genesis, is blessing his 12 sons plus Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. All of those blessings foreshadow what happens to these tribes and where they go. And cost him his inheritance, right? I don't care, and so it says, thus Esau despised his birthright. Can you all hear me well enough?
A little strange there.
Yeah, and my wife and daughter have gone back to State College, so it's just me on the internet, but the storms may be doing something. So this passage does give us this sense, and it states, Esau despised his birthright. Does that justify what Jacob did?
Well, I think Jacob is taking advantage of his brother. But for Esau, he didn't earn his birthright. It's not like he went out and caught a bear and brought it back. So it's,
well, except the birthright, you earn the birthright by being born first.
Right, I know. But he didn't feel like he really did it.
I see what you're saying. Esau didn't feel a sense of having earned or the value of the birthright because it was just given to him. What does it mean to me and we don't know the ages, right? We have no idea how old they are. It could be 14.
Right.
He's more worried about a skateboard than inheritance.
Yeah.
He's more worried about getting a bowl of stew.
He's hungry.
Yep.
He's hangry. Yeah. I've not heard that halt, by the way, Harriet. That's great. So does that justify what Jacob does here? Because this is what I've read often, is that this, in commentaries, especially more conservative ones, thus Esau despised his birthright. It's that it was justified what Jacob did.
No, not to me.
Kathy says no. I would say we don't need to go either way with it. Again, I would really emphasize that this is building up of these characters. It's showing us the growing planning nature of Jacob. I'm trying to be really careful with my words. By the way, the image there, so the notes tell me, is Esau building the city of Edom. I couldn't find any manuscript images of him getting his bowl of stew from Jacob. So I went with what his ultimate destiny was. And I kind of, there are times when I think I wonder whether or not Esau, even as an adult, would have minded. He liked to be out there in the wide open world. He liked to be doing stuff. Would he necessarily have wanted the politics and everything of being a patriarch? Because it was. I mean, it was sitting, hearing cases, adjudicating. There were probably at least hundreds of people associated and around, and you've got to manage all that. I think Esau himself probably, as far as the birthright is concerned, would have been like, oh yeah, I don't want that. No, you run Dad's business. I'll be happy to work in the shop. I'll be the foreman. You run the business, kind of thing. I'm really mixing my images and metaphors, but there we go. All right. So let's skip ahead to then the blessing. So what happens is Isaac is getting old. His eyesight is going, and he says to Esau, see, I'm old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me. Then prepare for me savory food such as I like. So Esau clearly was able to cook too. And bring it to me to eat so that I may bless you before I die. So then the passage that you all have in front of you here. Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I have heard your father say to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me savory food to eat, that I may bless you before the Lord before I die. So as I said, this blessing it's prophetic, and it has the power of God granting a dying patriarch their blessings on their children. Rebekah says, now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock, get me 2 choice kids, baby goats, so that I may prepare. I don't need to tell you all that. I need to tell undergraduates, baby, from them savory food for father such as he likes. And you shall take it to your brother to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. But Jacob said to his mother Rebekah, look, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am of smooth skin. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse on myself and not a blessing. His mother said to him, let your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my word, and go and get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food such as his father loved. I didn't give you all of that. He goes in, of course, this manuscript. I like, here's Esau with some game. And he's like, what the heck? Almost looks like he's got gang signs there in his left hand. But that's Isaac blessing Jacob with Rebekah standing there. Right, so he does all of this. It is interesting that in this portion, Esau, well, it's interesting to me, who studies literature, that Esau is ready to go and prepare this food once he makes the kill. But it's actually Rebekah who is, even though Jacob is said to be the cook, Rebekah is going to prepare this particular meal. So the narrative is really emphasizing Rebekah taking on this responsibility. There's a shift here. So he's just following orders, as I think Anne or Kathy may have said early on. All right. So as I said, or maybe I didn't say it explicitly, the blessing is greater than the birthright then. And Esau will ultimately get really upset about this. So what are your thoughts, first of all, about this scene? Any comments?
Well, I don't know why Isaac didn't know about what God said. I mean, why is it that Rachel is told one of your sons is gonna, it's gonna be switched, but Isaac goes through all these years and never gets that message?
Is it that, or could it be? I mean, we don't know. It's a really good point, Harriet. And I've wondered if it could be that Isaac's view is, it's going to be whoever I say it's going to be. No prophecy is going to tell me what to do. I'm in control. I mean, it makes me wonder, because if that was a narrative on the backside, then it does change how we read this passage, because now this passage is God working to say, no, Isaac, you don't get to say, I get to say. But it's a really good point, Harriet.
That's kind of what happens throughout Genesis. I mean, you know, God says, if you kill it to Cain and Abel, if you kill your brother, you're going to die, or if you eat this, you're going to die. And then he changes his, I mean, that's sort of the message to me in this from the beginning of this story, is that God's really going to determine who's who, not, you know, how your birth order or anything like that. That God's ultimately got all of the decisions and the power in his hand.
You are exactly right. And in fact, as it goes through, none of the, that is a major theme of Genesis, is that the cultural norms and expectations, especially in terms of inheritance, are turned upside down by God. God's going to do what God's going to do is absolutely a Genesis theme, for sure. And I think your question about how would Isaac not have known about this is a really good point. When I wrote an essay on this section, I reflected as well about Mary. When Gabriel came to her, she kept all these things in her heart. Now, in that essay, I argued that Mary is a stark contrast to Rebekah, that she's just to be blunt, a better model in the way she guarded and kept these things. But maybe Rebekah did the same. Again, that political aspect. She may have felt she needed to hold on to that for herself. We just don't know. But it does shape then how you read this section.
Well, I like your point about Genesis shows us how emotions are developed that reign. And I found a commentary about this that I don't know, I did not know who Malbim was, M-A-L-B-I-M, a biblical commentator, but he said, evidently they think that Rachel and Isaac did talk about this and they just disagreed, which would make me more into this is about people listening to God, not what they wanted.
Right, exactly. And again, we don't know that, but if we take that assumption, it shapes and we read it slightly differently. But either way, as Harriet pointed out, either way, the result from the prophecy onwards is the normal inheritance will be turned upside down, which is interesting when you think about Jewish and Christian law as it develops, canon law and so forth, where there is this strong argument, well, it's a patriarchal society, we should follow those models, the eldest inherits and so forth and so on. The first book of the Bible, almost every single example is, not necessarily. We don't have to do that. And even in the Torah itself, when you get into Leviticus, I'm blanking on their names, but there's an example that's put forward of a man who dies with no sons, and his daughters are allowed to inherit.
Yeah.
And in spite of that, centuries of rabbinic law developed to go, yeah, well, that was Moses. We're not Moses, How do you think God's prophecy was supposed to be fulfilled? Is this what God intended?
Wow, what a question.
Well, it's interesting with you're right, throughout Genesis, God is the primary actor throughout the whole book.
Mm-hmm.
But the primary actor here is Rebekah.
Yes.
And so the question is God using the underhanded methods of Rebekah to get God's way, or is God getting God's way in spite of Rebekah?
Exactly. Right. This is what this brings up for me, is this broader, bigger question of what is often referred to as the sovereignty of God. So when I've taught this in a more conservative context, and I say something about, and at that time I just asserted, I didn't say it rhetorically. I said, surely this isn't how God intended it to be. And several people got very upset and said, of course it is. This is what happened in the Bible. Therefore, this is what God wanted. Because they were coming out of a strong Calvinist background, or neo-Calvinist, that argues that everything that happens, not just in the Bible, everything that happens is ordained by God. And there's a whole section in my book on this, by the way, about the sovereignty of God with regard to tragedy and suffering. And Mac, I like the way you phrase it, which I've just lost. What is it? God's will being done in spite of Rebekah.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, this is a great example of how I understand this theology. First of all, I would define sovereignty, not that God is in charge, not that God manipulates every single moment and design. God did not manipulate which shirt I would wear. Certainly if my wife were here, she's less happy about this shirt than other shirts that I wear, but I like it. But rather think about, this is all intended on an analog with a human model. What can a human sovereign do? Could a king come, if I were his subject, could a king come in and tell me what I was going to wear today? Yes. Would the king come in and do it? No. The king doesn't have time for that. You get on with things. And so I think the prophecy to Rebekah and Jacob's ultimate outcome is a good example of where, yes, God has plans. Clearly, the Bible teaches that clearly. There are big, clear, broad plans, and God is working that out. But God also gives us all sorts of freedom. And so we have room to do things. So I am confident and assured in the resurrection and our ultimate destination. But there's a lot of miles between here and there that I've got to put in, right? I will do a quick, we could look at this as well, God helps those who help themselves. That famous scriptural verse, right? Not No, I'm asserting. Does anybody want to push back? I'm asserting that this is not what God theoretically would have. Why do you all think I can say with such certainty this is not the way God intended it?
It's deception. I mean,
good. So deception meaning what then? Because it's deception, that's not the way.
Well, it's I don't think God would have us. It's not fully truthful, Isaac didn't know what he was doing.
Yeah, well, you read it backwards, right? You're saying this is accomplished through deception. Elsewhere in Scripture, our sense is that God is not a deceiving God. So that makes it unlikely. What else? It's destructive, it's divisive, it's hurtful, right? I think one of the ways, strong bits of evidence, we'll go through a couple of these, and mindful of our time, actually. I thought we had plenty of time, and now we're like. So Esau gets really angry. He's going to go kill Jacob once his father has died and the mourning period is over. And so Rebekah, she does another ruse with Isaac, saying, I don't want Jacob marrying one of these women. Let's send him back to my brother in Haran, and he can marry somebody within the family, within the broader tribe, and so forth and so on. He marries his cousin. But notice the phrase I've highlighted. Why should I lose both of you in one day? So that's interesting to me in a sense, on the level that it reflects still an affection for Esau. Esau's still her son too, and so she still loves him. But as far as we can tell in the biblical text, Rebekah never sees Jacob again. In fact, this is the reason why I chose this illumination, because at least the notes with the manuscript say that that's Jacob leaving to go to Haran, and Rebekah blessing him, giving him giving him the sign of a blessing, presumably not in the cross, but she loved him. And the result of the deception that she orchestrated is that she would never see him again. If she intended to support him because she wanted the benefits of his being the heir, she didn't live to see it. She didn't reap that benefit. So there's one aspect of it. Another there are many things along the way. Jacob's narrative and story is really powerful, but is this. Mac characterized right at the beginning that, Mac, I just love saying your name. Mac characterized at the beginning Jacob as a planner and a deceiver. And it is true. He is a trickster. I mean, there's a whole genre of literature that scholarly literature that looks at Jacob as a trickster, as that kind of a character. And so when he's with his brother, when he's with his uncle Laban, you may recall that he does all sorts of little tricks. Now, these are not deceitful, but for example, Laban tells him he can have all of the dark sheep or spotted goats. And so it's a very interesting passage, by the way, because anybody remember what Jacob does at the watering hole?
He removes the stone for the sheep to drink.
Well, that's how he meets Rachel at the beginning. But then once they're married, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Once they're married, Laban says, tell you what, you work for me. I'll let you have any spotted goat or dark sheep, which is always going to be, they're genetically, they are recessive, right? They wouldn't talk in these terms, but they would know from experience that in a field of 100 sheep, 4 or 5 might be brown or dark. In a field of 100 goats, you might have, 4 or 5 or 10 that would be spotted.
So he devised a way to have all the sheep in the future become spotted or, whatever, so he could get them.
Right. There's 2 things going on in the narrative. One is the genetics that we now understand, that they instinctively understood, which is he moved apart all of the spotted goats and the dark sheep and kept them together. That way, recessive is breeding with recessive, right? But then there's this story in Genesis about how he took sticks and he carved them so that the sticks looked mottled. So he peeled off some parts of bark so that the sticks would look spotted. And he set them in front of the watering trough so that when the ewes would come and drink, the rams would mount them. This doesn't seem right for a Bible study, does it? That the ewes would be looking at these spotted or dark sticks when they're conceiving their lambs or their kids. And my wife and I were talking about this. Is actually there's a section in my doctoral thesis about this. This was an ancient belief that what you saw upon conception is what you gave birth to. So there's a rabbinic story from, I think, Ethiopia, the Jewish community in Ethiopia, where an Ethiopian queen gave birth to a very light-skinned child. And the king is ready to kill his wife because she's clearly mated with a white man. And the rabbi comes in and says, "Sire, do you have a marble bust in your bedchamber?" "Why, yes, I do." And he said, "Well, your wife was looking at that when she conceived, and that's why your child is light-skinned." So this is an ancient belief. I can't remember the Latin term for it, but it does exist. So there is a shrewdness, a savviness, a very proverbial, where the Proverbs talk about, being shrewd and savvy, to Jacob. That's a smart thing for him to do. He and Laban are constantly back and forth, right? Do you remember, so he sees Rachel, he wants to marry Rachel. She's the second daughter. What happens on his wedding night?
He puts Leah in there.
Right. He wakes up the next morning, presumably because it's dark and she's veiled. When morning came, it was Leah. That's what Genesis says. I love it. Baboka, Leah. It's very short in Hebrew. And Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Why then have you deceived me?" Laban said, "This is not done in our country. giving the younger before the firstborn. So this, I kind of inverted the storyline, but Laban knew already what Jacob's story was. Word had spread that Jacob had usurped his elder brother. And Laban said, "I'm not going to let you do it here, buddy." The deception, this impact continues. Jacob gets very savvy, so he's able to leave with massive herds and flocks of spotted goats and dark sheep. All sorts of interesting things in there, with the daughter taking, with Rachel stealing the household gods and so forth and so on. But the really telling point that I think drives home the fact that while clearly it was God's will and desire that Jacob should inherit, this isn't the way ideally that it should have been. Because notice how Joseph's brothers deceive their father. And remember, he didn't even learn the whole lesson about don't show favoritism among your sons, right? So he loved Joseph more, and that clearly didn't work out well. And so look what they do. Remember, he stole the blessing by killing a goat, using its meat and stew, and using its goat skins to be hairy and wear his brother's clothes. Joseph's brothers kill a goat. They take his robe, that famous robe, dip it in blood, and then take that back to dad. And they use the same tools. Clearly, they knew the story of their father's deception, how he got to be where he was. And they turn it around on him. And this narrative tells us, and it says right here, I shall go to Sheol to my son mourning. And years, what should have been his best years, presumably, leaving is very much sort of a crime doesn't pay kind of narrative. And yet, if we follow Joseph just briefly, of course, they're selling him into slavery is what exactly becomes the trigger or the lever that allows this nascent nation of Israel to survive. So there's so much more in Jacob's story and in Joseph's story, but that's the last slide. Thoughts? Last couple minutes of thoughts before service? Well, next week, we'll take a look at Moses. Again, bearing in mind we're looking at this combination of both what are we learning about from these characters, what sort of application there can be for us in our life, but also how we read Scripture more closely. I think the Jacob narrative is really quite powerful in many ways. Where as I've said, found I've spent a lot of time reflecting, and I encourage you, in addition to just reading the beginning of Exodus, to think about this notion of both that, yes, God is in control, especially in this world where we're living with plagues, right? We're living with slavery and racism and its impacts. To then assert that God remains in control is a great statement of faith. It can also be an escape. It can be a way that we say, well, God's in control. I don't have to worry about it. No. The biblical text makes it clear again and again and again. We have a responsibility. God will ensure that the ultimate goals that God has will be determined. But the most just, the most loving, and the best results will occur when we seek to do so within God's will and following the commandment to love one another rather than to seek our own benefit and glory. We have no idea what Jacob's story and what the story of Israel might have looked like if they had not manipulated and stolen the birthright and the blessing. But I have a feeling it would have looked a lot different. So, any last closing comments?
Thank you.
Thank you. Let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Amen.
Be to
Thank
God.
God.
Amen.
Thanks.
Wonderful.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, we'll stop the share and I'll end our Zoom. Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.